Ivo, and I want to take you to a different island now. It's going to be Cuba. We're going to talk about Havana, and mostly we're going to talk about a housing crisis. The housing crisis that is not being successfully addressed for decades now. Neither before or after the revolution. In fact, it's actually getting worse and worse. I spent a couple of months in Havana researching this very complex and dynamically changing environment. We all know Cuba is in a transitional moment of its history. I myself was a witness to the reopening of American embassy or opening of the first public internet hotspot ever on the island. Cuba used to be rich, but it is very poor now, and it struggles with many issues, one of which is the housing shortage. 1/3 of this country is awaiting housing, and housing is considered a right in Cuba. People are not per se homeless, they are just pushed into already overcrowded houses, leading to very unhealthy living conditions and densities. Some of the people decide to inhabit long, empty ruins just to make a home for themselves. And parallelly to this housing shortage, a big hotel shortage is visible as well due to the dynamically growing touristic demand. Only in 2016, a lot of hotels in Havana Vieja doubled their prices in 1 year. This is Havana Vieja, the old town. It is the oldest and a second densest housing district of Cuba. And it struggles with the highest risk of gentrification, and it's under a biggest problem of deterioration, as half of its buildings are threatened by collapse, and many collapsed already. Recently, flooded again, but the biggest problem, and probably the biggest threat to the original character of this district, is the touristic pressure. It leads to rapid gentrification of the area, and that naturally leads to increased polarization within a society that will soon drive the original inhabitants of Havana Vieja to the outskirts of the city, cutting them off from the possibility of gaining from the touristic boom that is taking place in Cuba. Havana is changing really fast. You can see that, and I think you all know. And we need to act now. Next 10, 20, or 30 years will most likely shape inhabitants of Havana's future. Housing shortage is caused mostly by the fact that Cubans do not have money to build or renovate houses. As simple as that. Hotel situation, to the contrary, does not suffer from financial issues, but it's rightfully not to grow freely, especially in the old town, as the impact of mass tourism can be very dangerous if invited on wrong terms. But I believe one could imagine buildings in areas attracting tourists that would consist of both social housing for Cubans and a proportionate number of hotel units weaved into them. These hotel units would generate the money to pay off the loan taken for the construction of the building itself. Cuban inhabitants, as a collective, would take care for the guests and at the same time make steady living. In some years, the demand for hotel units in Havana will peak, then decline and stabilize. What would happen if we were to build enough hotels to satisfy the peak demand? After 30, 40 years, a lot of them would be empty, obsolete. This is not a sustainable model. In a model I put forward, the hotel units weaved into social housing are pre-designed to accommodate this dynamic. They later on, when the demand is no longer there and the loan is paid off, will be able to freely and organically merge, creating new apartments and helping to ease the housing crisis further. I'm using other existing components that are there already. Culture of cooperatives, well developed in Cuba. New self-employed sector of the economy. Since 7 years ago, that was the first year you could become self-employed in Cuba. Political reality where everybody is supposed to get a little, not one group getting a lot. Office of the city historian and their experience, they pioneered the system of redirecting the income from the touristic business into social investments, and so-called casa particulares, very famous now. Since 1997, Cubans are allowed to rent rooms for tourists. And it's not only an opportunity to make money for them, but it also changed the relation between a tourist and a hotel worker into a host and a guest. So is it financially feasible? This is like the kind of bottom line of this all. 70 square meters of social housing, if it was balanced with 20 square meters of the hotel units, and if we assume today market's lowest prices for hotels in Havana Vieja, and with only 50% of the nights booked, where Havana Vieja now is booked for months, this building will pay itself off in under 7 years, while supplying 2 members of each family with wages 4 times greater than today's official average. There is a lot of urban gaps in Havana. A lot of buildings collapsed already. So these buildings could address exactly those plots and help to rebuild the city at the same time. I want to also change the construction process a little, because we need to think of how to generate money to build in Cuba, but also how to spend it. So the architect will be responsible for all the permanent elements of the building. But each future tenant is given a portion of a loan to design and execute their own apartment with an architect as an advisor at that point. Why do we do it? We include them in a project as soon as possible, but it will also create a twist. They will need to hire people to do that task. They will need to hire plumbers, electricians, masonry workers, maybe interior designers. Who will they hire? They will hire people from the emerging self-employed sector of the economy, stimulating it, creating a trickle-down effect of money from the big budget into this economy that needs the stimulation, because it's going to be very important for the future of this country. To test this idea, I designed a couple of prototypes, testing this in different urban setups, shapes and sizes. All of them follow guidelines like, the first one I talked about, hotel units need to be pre-designed to later on become apartments. We are also putting a lot of effort on natural ventilation, passive cooling methods, multiple patios, open ground floor. The open ground floor and the roof terrace becomes a collective space for both tenants and tourists, with collective dining, leisure, laundry, and other activities. And we have also some spaces for businesses in the front, the small businesses and street sellers, because there is no infrastructure for street sellers right now in Havana, and it's just a very popular way of getting some extra cash. Due to the very crowded situation, the Cubans love to socialize on the streets. And maybe, for example, this columnade for street sellers in the evening, these benches that normally are used by street sellers in the evening could become social spots. My intention is that all these prototypes, all these buildings should, in the future, have a very vibrant relation between the Havana streetscape and the common ground floor through this business zone in the front. I'm just briefly going to show you now, for example, a plan like this with 2 apartments, one on the top and one on the bottom, and 2 hotel units in the middle. After the loan is paid off and the demand is no longer there, yeah, we could get a 3rd apartment with no problem, or we could incorporate the hotel units into the existing apartments, giving them the possibility of growth as the family is growing. All the buildings were designed with multiple plans just to prove their flexibility. And the bottom line is you need to maintain the proportion between the social housing and hotel units in order to be able to pay the building in 7 years. And then you can build another one and maybe another one and continue to address the housing shortage. This is a development model, not an aesthetical one. Each building will have to be designed individually, but in my professional opinion as an architect, these buildings should deeply respect Havana Vieja's context and create beautiful quality with honest material usage, ornamental Cuban handcraft, elegant proportions, and the playfulness with which Cubans love to use color. I did not invent anything per se, but I think in a troubled context like this, and in such a complex context, and the necessity of doing it right now, one needs to work with what is already there. So I hope this symbiotic relation between social housing and dispersed tourism that I put forward could become a tool for inhabitants of Havana Vieja to fight against negative impacts of gentrification that is happening there, simply. Thank you.